Hello, I'm BMillzebub, and welcome to my channel. I told you on Twitter that I would keep my eye on the news regarding the Vatican Sex Abuse Summit and give you a rundown of the news as well as my opinion. Well, here it is. To start, before the summit even began, Pope Francis decided that instead of attending a meeting with survivors of abuse by Catholic priests, he would delegate that to the Vatican's lead sex abuse investigator. But as though snubbing survivors of abuse who were invited to meet church leaders wasn't enough, Pope Francis said this: "One cannot live a whole life accusing the church, and the people who did were, quote, the friends, cousins, and relatives of the devil."
Wow. Fuck you, dude. How has the Me Too movement not fucked you up yet? Oh, and hi, BMillzebub. I've been wanting to follow this for a while. Do you mind if I join in?
Yeah, man, glad to have you. But first of all, Francis, how dare you try to turn this back on the victims of sexual abuse by priests who represent your church, which you have led since 2013. How dare you try to frighten your victims by saying they're friends or relatives of the devil, a character they fear for seeking justice. Friends and relatives of the devil for rightly accusing priests who victimize people, sometimes for years on end, and trying to make it right by bringing this to the light and having their abuser held accountable. You do not get to play the victim here, Francis. You and your priests in your church are not victims here, Francis. You, your priests, and your church are the assailants and conspirators in cover-ups to protect the church and its priests instead of the people you like to say that you shepherd over.
If they're wolves, maybe.
But let's move on to what's next. Pope Francis made a list of 21 reflection points that was handed out to church leaders. Let's run through them quickly, shall we? 1. To prepare a practical handbook indicating the steps to be taken by authorities at key moments when a case emerges. How about no? When an accusation is made, contact civil authorities to do the investigating. Do not keep the investigation within and by the church, and definitely do not try to dictate how secular authorities can perform their investigation, which will almost certainly be more thorough than yours. 2. To equip oneself with listening structures that include trained and expert people who can initially discern the cases of the alleged victims. Once again, contact civil authorities first. 3. Establish the criteria for the direct involvement of the bishop or religious superior.
Can I guess one? Civil authorities.
4. Implement shared procedures for the examination of the charges, the protection of the victims, and the right of defense of the accused. That's for civil authorities. How has this not been mentioned on the list yet? 5. Inform civil authorities and the higher ecclesiastical authorities in compliance with civil and canonical norms. Finally! Why is this not number 1? Not so much the ecclesiastical bit, but definitely the civil authorities.
Also, to hell with your canonical norms. This is what people have a problem with. Your norms. They don't match society's.
6. Make a periodic review of protocols and norms to safeguard a protected environment for minors in all pastoral structures. Protocols and norms based on the integrated principles of justice and charity, so that the action of the Church in this matter is in conformity with her mission. good idea. Some level of self-policing is necessary, but as soon as an accusation or crime is discovered, the civil authorities should be the first phone call that gets made. 7. Establish specific protocols for handling accusations against bishops. Fuck! They lost it again. Anyway, why do bishops need this extra layer of protection, I wonder?
You already had that in your last playbook. Care to specify on those protocols? I seriously hope they aren't keep quiet and continue on like everything's normal, and, in case anyone tries to tell anyone except a church official, victim blame.
8. Accompany, protect, and treat victims, offering them all the necessary support for a complete recovery. No. Your accompaniment, protection, and treatment turned them into a victim. At that point, your church has broken trust, but should definitely be responsible for the recovery of victims, by which I mean the church should pay for it, not be the ones giving the victims therapy.
I need to read this again. Protect and treat victims, offering them all of the necessary support for a complete recovery. Notice the vagueness. Protect and treat. How? Offer them all necessary support. Like what? Christian, Catholic counseling? Are you qualified to do that, or do you have something else in mind? Like specify. Please specify.
9. Increase awareness of the causes and consequences of sexual abuse through ongoing formation initiatives of bishops, religious superiors, clerics, and pastoral workers. Causes of sexual abuse? Consequences should absolutely be known and enforced. But when this reflection point mentions causes, I hope it refers to the abuser and not to the victim. The list doesn't say. 10. Prepare pathways of pastoral care for communities injured by abuses and penitential recovery routes for the perpetrators. Pathways of pastoral care? You know what? Christopher Hitchens said it best when he said this.
Well, I'm sorry. They've already had that. And to say that this is the responsibility laid upon you by the horrific admission that you've already had to make is not accepting responsibility in any adult sense.
And as for your penitential and recovery routes for perpetrators, that will be handled by the civil authorities. 11. To consolidate the collaboration with all people of goodwill and with the operators of mass media in order to recognize and discern real cases from false ones and accusations of slander, avoiding rancor and insinuations, rumors, and defamation. You do not get to discern the real cases of abuse from false ones. You've already shown that you can't be trusted to do that, and more importantly, that's the responsibility of civil authorities.
You know what? I say take a whack at it. Please, case by case, tell us with what's been revealed, which are real and which are fake. You've been sitting on these records for at least decades. So it shouldn't be hard for you to answer this, or any of them, immediately. Please prove how competent or incompetent you are and do it publicly.
12. To raise the minimum age for marriage to 16 years. So currently canon law says that boys have to be at least 16 and girls have to be at least 14 years old to marry. So I guess this is an improvement?
I argue that people should have the right of religious practice. This makes me not want to do that. Also, I want something in these goddamn guidelines to talk about consent, for fuck's sake.
13. Establish provisions that regulate and facilitate the participation of lay experts in investigations and in the different degrees of judgment of canonical processes concerning sexual and or power abuse. No! God damn it! Just call the real authorities and let them sort it out.
This is turning out to be a good argument against the church being allowed to make any of its own rules, investigating anything related to civil law.
14. The right to defense, the principle of natural and canon law of presumption of innocence must also be safeguarded until the guilt of the accused is proven. Therefore, it is necessary to prevent the lists of the accused being published, even by the diocese, before the preliminary investigation and the definitive condemnation. I get this one, as long as it's the civil authorities leading the investigation and not the church. But the accused should probably, actually definitely, be removed from priestly duties for the protection of alleged victims. 15. Observe the traditional principle of proportionality of punishment with respect to the crime committed, to decide that priests and bishops guilty of sexual abuse of minors leave the public ministry. Have your own internal punishments. I really don't care. But a guilty priest needs to go through the real justice system.
This is the difference between a dictatorship and democracy. You shouldn't get to decide what happens to the accused in your corporation. Your corporation is in a society, and it is affecting those in that society. Therefore, society rules take precedence over your corporation. If you disagree to play by society's rules, then maybe you should reconsider being in one.
16. Introduce rules concerning seminarians and candidates for the priesthood or religious life. Be sure that there are programs of initial and ongoing formation to help them develop their human, spiritual, and psychosexual maturity, as well as their interpersonal relationships and their behavior. I actually think I like this one, but any programs used for those things should be based on science, not the bunk you believe.
I don't think I like it. Again, it's too vague. What are those rules? And we need one rule completely ruled out. Celibacy. Without that, this whole thing is pretty much just fucking garbage.
17. Be sure to have psychological evaluations by qualified and accredited experts for candidates for the priesthood and consecrated life. I really like this one, as long as the accreditation is real and not the nonsense accreditation Shannon Q talks about in her videos about Christian counseling. You will find links to that in the description.
Word. Check her shit out.
18. Establish norms governing the transfer of a seminarian or religions aspirant, yes, it did say religions aspirant, from one seminary to another, as well as a priest or religious, once again, poor grammar, I know, from one diocese or congregation to another. You don't have these already? Or is this you hinting that you plan on shuffling accused priests around again?
It sounds like to me that this would just make them shuffle around priests more often. This could potentially keep any given priest from preying on any given single child or group of children for too long, but it also makes it less noticeable when you have to transfer a pedophile priest. So, not good enough, to say the least.
19. Formulate mandatory codes of conduct for all clerics, religious, service personnel, and volunteers to outline appropriate boundaries in personal relationships. Be specific about the necessary requirements for staff and volunteers, and check their criminal record. Seriously? Did you not already have something in place for this? The church is well over 1,000 years old. Are we meant to believe that you didn't already instruct your priests on appropriate relationships, or even do a criminal background check on people who work for the church?
I believe it. But yeah, this really could or should have been number 1 on the list too.
20. Explain all information on data on the dangers of abuse and its effects, how to recognize signs of abuse, and how to report suspected sexual abuse. All this must take place in collaboration with parents, teachers, professionals, and civil authorities. Why doesn't this immediately follow contacting civil authorities, which itself should be the first thing to appear on this list?
You're right. They could have narrowed this list down by a lot if they would have just contacted the authorities much sooner and stopped fucking around. Pun slightly intended.
21. Where it has not yet been in place, establish a group easily accessible for victims who want to report any crimes. Such an organization should have certain autonomy with respect to the local ecclesiastical authority and include expert persons, clerics and laity, who know how to express the church's attention to those who have been offended by improper attitudes on the part of clerics. Support groups are great, but the church responsible for creating victims, which has a vested interest in protecting itself first and foremost, should not have any power whatsoever in that group.
Agreed. Support groups provided by the church should be a must. But the first thing a victim should do is not go to the church to tell them that they want to complain to authorities. It should be encouraged to just go to the authorities. This is something that was very much frowned upon. If you look at the grand jury report from Pennsylvania, they discouraged anyone to actually go to authorities. And the Jehovah's Witnesses do this too. It's actually like in their rule book.
If I'm being totally honest, the vast majority of that list does nothing to inspire hope in me that the church will take substantive action against sex abuse by priests. And I really wish it would. Not for their reputation, because that's already gone, but for past, current, and future victims of the church. And in the description, you'll also find an NPR article titled "A Life Destroyed, Survivors and Pope at Vatican Summit Address Clergy Sex Abuse."
If you don't have a weak stomach, and you will be looking into this more, go check out the video that I released on my channel covering the Pennsylvania grand jury report. I went pretty in-depth and detail. It really is hard to read through most of all of that.
You'll be able to find Mac's video in the description below as well. But that's everything I found for Wednesday and Thursday, which is when the summit actually began. Let's talk about Friday now. Starting with Cardinal Gracias, who is the Archbishop of Mumbai, who said that the problem of sexual abuse is universal and not just relegated to certain parts of the world. So at least they admit that it's a real problem globally.
Finally, they admit that this is a problem globally, after decades of denial of them even saying that it's a local problem. It's nice to see that they're saying it's a problem at all. Hashtag low standards.
Although it should be mentioned that this same archbishop was approached by a mother in 2015 who told him her son had been raped by a parish priest. But he couldn't be bothered to take that information to the authorities because he was on his way to Rome. And speaking after Gracias was Chicago Cardinal Cupich, saying that bishops report directly to the Pope and have been unwilling to implement policy that would police each other. So with that in mind, he said that they shouldn't rely on the Holy See to come up with all the answers, and should instead rely on national level bishops' conferences. So bishops can't be trusted to police themselves, so as an alternative, they should police themselves. He did say that there should be lay experts to help lay out policy, but self-policing is self-policing, whether there are real experts helping to lay the foundation for self-investigation. And for reasons that should be plainly obvious by now, I don't trust the Catholic Church to self-police.
Policing themselves would be a good start, but they don't really have the best moral foundation for someone who thinks they have the best moral framework. Look, just seeing what they are saying they need to police themselves over shows that they can't be trusted. This is disgusting.
One last item from Friday. In a video on the LifeSite News YouTube channel, Archbishop Charles Scicluna, I'm assuming I'm saying that correctly, of Malta, admitted that gay subculture in seminaries has nothing to do with child sexual abuse. That's a breath of fresh air, I think, to finally admit that it's your own fault rather than the fault of gay people. However, that's all I could find for the events of Friday, so now let's talk about Saturday. And the news starting out isn't really good for the Catholic Church. But according to German Cardinal Reinhard Marx, the Catholic Church destroyed documents in order to cover up sexual abuse in what he called an abuse of power by the administration. To quote Cardinal Marx further, files that could have documented the terrible deeds and named those responsible were destroyed or not even created. And, instead of the perpetrators, the victims were regulated and silence imposed on them. The stipulated procedures and processes for the prosecution of offenses were deliberately not complied with, but instead canceled or overridden. The rights of the victims were effectively trampled underfoot and left to the whims of individuals. Harsh words against the church by someone so high-ranking in the institution, wouldn't you say, Mac?
I would say. I certainly didn't expect this coming from anyone associated with the church, especially someone with such a high ranking like a cardinal. But this is the problem. The church doesn't hold anyone accountable if it doesn't suit them. They're dirty cops. They're all just dirty cops.
In the next story, we have one of only 3 women to address the summit, Sister Veronica Openibo, a Nigerian-born nun, addressed the summit saying, "Let us not hide such events anymore because of the fear of making mistakes. Too often, we want to keep silent until the storm has passed. This storm will not pass. Our credibility is at stake." But that's not all Sister Openibo had to say. How could the clerical church have kept silent, covering these atrocities, she asked. We must acknowledge that our mediocrity, hypocrisy, and complacency have brought us to this disgraceful and scandalous place we find ourselves as a church. Not only was she frank in her address to the summit as a whole, but in her address to the Pope as well, where she said, "Brother Francis, thank you for providing this opportunity for us to check and see where we have acted strangely, ignorantly, secretly, and complacently." That may not sound like much to you or I, but for a nun at the bottom of the totem pole of power in the Catholic Church to speak so plainly to the head of that institution that has so much size and power behind it, I think shows a great deal of courage.
I do as well. And the first thing that you quoted of Sister Opinabos, she says, "Let us not hide such events anymore." Again, I'm just happy to see that the church is finally out of the stage of denial. They are actually owning up to the damage done. That said, though, if there wasn't so much media coverage and outcry from the outside, I can't help but believe that they would have just tried to keep this under wraps even longer. Or just pretend it never even happened. Just to recall, they sent lobbyists to the hearings during the Pennsylvania grand jury investigation.
And Vatican correspondent Valentina Alazraki for Mexico's Televisa told church leaders, "We have decided which side to be on. Journalists who seek the common good will be your worst enemies." Sounds an awful lot like someone we know, eh, Mac?
It does. And we need good journalists to dig up the truth. And some people can't handle the truth. But people like our friend Christy Santiago don't care what they find in the dark. They just bring it to light. And that's how we deal with the darkness.
And during the summit at the Vatican, survivors who had gathered in Rome to protest marched toward the Vatican shouting "Zero tolerance." So there's 3 days of a 4-day summit on sex abuse in the Catholic Church. Let's talk now about the final day. Not only did Pope Francis fail to promise a zero-tolerance policy on pedophile priests and anyone who participates in a cover-up, but he also tried to deflect some accountability by throwing out whataboutisms. He said that perpetrators of abuse were, quote, primarily parents, relatives, husbands of child brides, and teachers. Also mentioning how online porn and sex tourism make the issue worse, as well as calling priests who abuse children tools of Satan. Yet another way to deflect any responsibility from you and your church, which has protected these tools of Satan for decades. So what does that say about the church?
The Pope here is pushing blame in multiple directions. One being Satan, which most of you probably know I think is bullshit. But the other is porn, which usually doesn't hurt people. Catholics especially like to say that porn is sexually immoral. But what is sexual immorality? If you've seen any videos with my opinion on morality, you probably also know that I think this is also bullshit. Porn, sex, anything like this is only immoral when, or even only falls in to the realm of morality if consent is not given. Otherwise, it's amoral. And the only thing immoral here is you, the Pope. Otherwise, it's amoral. And the only thing immoral here is you, the Pope, finding somewhere else to place the blame.
Don't get me wrong. A few of the things the Pope mentioned are things worth dealing with, but they had nothing to do with the summit that's been going on for the last 4 days. It's just an attempt at deflection from the church's own responsibility.
Agreed.
I had no illusions that the church wouldn't take this issue with the seriousness it deserves. I guess I'm just disappointed by the people who say they have the best moral foundation, refusing to take full accountability and do everything necessary to remedy the catastrophic damage they've caused to the lives of people who follow and look up to them. Father Hans Zollner, who helped on the committee that organized this summit, actually said that he thinks the summit was, quote, quantitative and qualitative leap. I'm not sure where that belief comes from. Maybe he's privy to information the rest of us don't have. But I'm incredibly underwhelmed by the so-called progress made at this summit. And I'm not alone. Many of the survivors who went to Rome to make their voices heard seem to share my sentiments. Take what survivor Alessandro Battaglia said, for example. I've been waiting for 7 years. Others have been waiting for much longer. After 4 days, we get a piece of paper full of banality, and this is the church in which we're expected to believe. We are very disappointed. Or Francesco Zanardi. We're being taken for a ride. We expected a concrete response, but nothing useful has come out of this. In this speech, the church makes itself out to be the victim, but we are the victims. Or Peter Eiley. A child will be harmed today due to what the Pope didn't say today. What he's actually saying to all bishops is to keep on covering it up. He talks about families. Well, he is protecting his family. Why can't he enact zero tolerance into church law? He has the power to do that. The problem is his internal conflict. Does he protect the priests within his family or the victims of abuse? And Alberto Athi, who left the priesthood after he reported other priests for abusing children and was ignored. In fact, his bishop told him to shut up or leave. So no, I'm not the only one underwhelmed, disappointed, or even at least a little angry by what seems to be a total lack of progress and accountability by the church. Thoughts, Mac?
This is the problem with authoritarianism. It causes apologetics. People don't want to lose power or the faith that people have in them. This has always been one of my biggest issues with religion in general. God is a dictator. He never admits when he's wrong. He just justifies it, and then he tells you that you'll never understand the mind of God. The Catholic Church, the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, Baptists, Muslims, they all do this. They justify immoral actions and they victim blame. Given they don't do this exclusively, that's not all they do, but we have pretty good examples. God committed genocide because those people were evil heathens. Priest says to child, you deserve this because you sinned.
There is no doubt in my mind that this past 4-day summit was nothing more than a piece of theater to placate not only the victims of, but the critics of the church as well. Strong language was used on both sides by critics as well as defensive representatives of the church. But only one side is capable of changing the church from within. And strong words from church representatives are meaningless without the concrete action that was promised. To be honest, I knew from the beginning that very little would likely be accomplished at the summit. 4 days isn't long enough to make that real change. Even Pope Francis tried to lower expectations for the summit a month ago before the summit even began, for that very same reason. Because any substantive change will have to be made in the days, months, and hopefully not, but very likely years after the summit. But when I think about the church's track record, I find myself with very little, if any, hope that change will come at all. Got any final thoughts, Mac?
Yes, I knew right off the bat that this issue was going to have unserious solutions given. If the church cared, and yes, I am asserting that at least the highest ranking officials of the church don't care, then they would have held a summit or something like it back in September. A month would have been too long to wait, but instead they waited 6. I'm glad this didn't blow over though, which I previously had mentioned that the Pope had hoped, I'm sure. But people didn't let it happen. We stayed active. At least 15 more states in the U.S. opened statewide investigations. And people like you posted your thoughts on social media and went to churches across the country. But it seems like we can't alleviate the pressure yet.
Alright, everyone, that'll do it for this one. Thank you, Gray Skeptic, for helping me out with this. You'll find links to his social media and YouTube channel in the description box below.
The pleasure was all mine. Thanks for having me on. This is a really important topic, and I really appreciate being part of the conversation. If you haven't subscribed to BMillzebub's channel yet, what are you waiting for? If you haven't subbed to me, there's still time to fix that problem too. Hope to see you all later, and don't forget, the answers are in the gray area. Thanks again, Bub.
Alright, everybody, like Max said, if you're not subbed to me yet, please do so. And if you're not subbed to Mac yet, sub to him as well. Also, don't forget to follow us on social media to keep up with all our comings and goings. Take it easy, everyone, and I will see you all in the next one.